Rajarshi Sengupta, and we are continuing our discussion on Kalamkari and allied practices. So, as we have already started discussing the differences between painted and printed Kalamkari, we see that how there are also other techniques which are involved in making this Kalamkari fabrics. So, there are particular kind of textiles we see in which needed to be made in the printing technique. Then there are particular kind of textiles we find them to be more suited to be made in the painting technique. And then there is also the technique of resist dyeing. Now, what is resist dyeing? So in this case, what we see and the image that we have on screen, and in this one we see that there is this extensive use of indigo and this pale indigo that we have on this flower motif, and in this one we have this pale indigo, and of course one darker shade of indigo here in the edges of this flower. So this one, what we see here is this is not really made directly with a pen, or it is not really sort of painted on the top of this textile, but in this case what happens, we see that it is a reverse process that is used. So for example, that there is a particular kind of column that would be used here for sort of covering the rest of the area. So for example, if we consider this to be the textile and this is the area that needs to have indigo, then all these other areas need to be covered with wax, and that is how wax resist drawing starts. And then with the molten wax, all the rest of the area is covered, and even here where within this blue surface, wherever we see that there are those white dots, those dots are also something, those are covered with wax, and that is how these patterns are created in this textile surface. And then it is dipped in the indigo vat. So this is a very different technique from the other painting and printing, because what happens in this case that you are submerging the entire textile in a vat, and there is a risk of the other areas catching the color as well, but still it needs to be done in this particular way, because in indigo, one of the characters of indigo is that if you need a area that needs to have even shade of blue, that needs to be dipped and it cannot be really drawn with hand. So that is a reason what we see that this kind of textiles, they also employed this highly specialized skill of using this wax resist drawing, and that is how larger areas were covered with wax resist. At the same time, we find that the smaller areas with these dots and everything, those were also covered with wax, and then it is dipped in the indigo dye. So this is another way of doing this drawing technique that we see, and it also sort of comes hand in hand with the painting as well as the printing technique. So for example, in many of these pieces in which we see this resist dyeing has been done, in many of those images we see that already some of the elements were drawn, hand drawn. So for example, in this case we see that the edges of, or the contours of this floral motifs or the vegetal motifs are actually first hand drawn, and then on the top of it modern dyeing is been done, and then after the modern dyeing, then it is covered with wax and it is dipped in the indigo solution for achieving these shades of blue in this piece. Now for printed textiles as well, we see that if there is requirement for this even shades of blue, or in particular cases where we find that really dark shades of blue are required, in those cases we also see that the printed textiles are also dipped in this vat dye, in indigo vat, and then that is how they have been dyed. So these are some of the aspects we see that for kalamkari making, when we sort of and how this kalamkari making is different from perhaps when we discuss the brocade making technique or a particular woven technique, is that there are many different kinds of techniques which are all coming together to form this idea of kalamkari. It is not really just one set of technique, but historically there have been many of this kind of techniques like painting, printing, resist dyeing, and also there is this other process which we find that is called as discharge process, in which the surface is already dyed with, those are usually modern dyed, and on the top of that a particular kind of acidic solution, so for example like lemon juice, and then things like oxalic acid which is also obtained naturally, and then with that we find them to be used on the top of this modern dyed surface to take out the color, or like to bleach those areas, and that is how like motifs are created. So in southern Coromandel, in this town of Pudukkottai and in the neighboring areas, we find that this kind of resist dyeing is something that had been continued for at least for like 2-3 centuries or so on. So these are different kind of techniques we find, and all those techniques are sort of clubbed together under the term kalamkari. And we'll come to this discussion that why this, all these terms can, all these different kind of practices can be termed as kalamkari. So before we get into the details of the process of making, we also need to see that which are the places where this kalamkari textiles are produced, and whether the place also has a significance in terms of how these textiles are made and how they contributed to the specificity of these textiles. So this is a map of the Coromandel region in the right side of the screen, and in this one we see that in the Coromandel region there are 3 mighty rivers. There are many rivers, but then there are 3 prime rivers which sort of like mark the landscape of this Coromandel region, as well as like part of the Deccan. And in these 3 mighty rivers would be one Godavari on northern Coromandel, and then Krishna, that is almost like the at the juncture of northern and southern Coromandel, and then towards the south we find river Kaveri. So all these 3 rivers and then the delta region of these rivers are something that we find that to be very significant. And in these regions we find that there is numerous crisscrossing of canals, and those canals have been very important in terms of the dye making, washing, and of course like production of this dyed, painted and printed textiles. So in this for this thing, one thing one can understand that in these regions there is abundance of water, then there is also like abundance of particular kind of fuel which are used in making this kind of textiles. So why fuel is used, and that is because of extensive amount of boiling that needs to be done for the modern printing. So for those reasons fuel is required, but it is not usually the wooden wood is not really used for many of this boiling activities. But we see that how rice husk is something that is preferred in the northern Coromandel and also like in the other regions. And minded that the entire this Coromandel region that we see there, and which is also characterized by hot and humid climate, are also mostly agriculturally rich. In all these places we find that the production of paddy and different other kinds of crops are being continued for longest period of time. So for those reasons, like some of the residues of paddy production, like for example the rice husk and all those things, we see them to be also used in the textile industry for boiling and so on. So this kind of things we also see that how certain kind of agricultural practices that also support the artisanal practices in these regions. And apart from that we also see that how the its proximity to the sea is something that is also significant in terms of like getting all the resources of water and everything else. Now apart from the rivers and then like the agricultural fields, and then also like the available dye stuff and all those other things, something that this its proximity to the sea enabled these places is this connection to the places which are not really within the Indian subcontinent. So what we see here is that this tremendous amount of the trade network, the tremendous amount of back and fro movement that we see in these regions, and those would be spearheaded by the traders, ambassadors, seafarers and many other people, and those would also contribute tremendously to the making of this kind of textiles. So what happens in this case, we see that how the Coromandel region, if we see it here in this map in the left side, that if this is the southern Indian peninsula and the Coromandel region and the Malabar region, we find that to be always like associated with trade routes, and the trade routes which connected not only just part of like Indian subcontinent with like Middle East or like with the part of Southeast Asia and so on, but also like with Eastern Asia, with part of like this Eastern African coast and so on. So this is how we see that this extensive connections, they also enabled not only just like the traders to arrive here, but also that we see how different kind of images, different kind of like aesthetics, they also arrived in this workshops, this coastal workshops, and that is how they enrich the production of kalamkari. So these are why, as I have also mentioned it briefly in the earlier module, that even when we are talking about trade networks and so on, why trade networks are something that is very important in kalamkari production is exactly because of that. Its proximity to the sea had enabled certain kind of exchanges between the locals and the people who would arrive from other places, and that tremendously sort of boosted the aesthetics as well as the spirit of making these kalamkari textiles. Now getting more in the details of these aspects here, so we see that there are places like Polavaram, and which is here in the right side of the screen, and in which we see that this lush green area which would be very close to this historic port town of Machilipatnam, we find it there, and this lush green area with all agricultural fields and canals and all those things around it, we see that how that supported this particular kind of dyeing activities and printing and of course the boiling activities. And mostly as the regions that we are looking at, they are warm, and there is practically no winter in this region. So that's the reason what we see that all over the year we have good sunlight, and for dyeing activity, like sunlight is something that is very important. Now monsoon is the time we also find that when the dyeing activity is usually, it disrupts a bit, and the dyers mostly also believe that this drizzling rain or the rain that sort of like stays for a prolonged period of time with no sign of the sun, that does not really do well for dyeing. And so it requires like this warm and humid climate, and then like of course that abundance of sunlight. So those things we find that to be there in these regions, which also supported this textile making and dyeing and everything else. Now the other thing we also see in this historic port town of Machilipatnam, that since I have already mentioned that there were many of those trade routes which connected this area, and we see that during this early modern period in the 16th and 17th century, this region also like the port of Machilipatnam was one of the most important ports on the southeastern Coromandel, southeastern coastline of India, and where like this port site also worked as one of the prime port site for the Qutub Shahi dynasty. And so for that reason we find that through this port there were many kind of trade goods which were either sent from the inland to the other places outside of the Indian subcontinent, or things were brought to this port site and then those were dispersed inland. So apart from like the trade goods, like different kind of artifacts and so on, we also find that mention of different kind of fruits which arrived in this place. So for example, the fruit pineapple which arrived there with the Portuguese, and then like how that also had a huge significance in shaping the Deccani material culture. So this kind of things we see that this port sites were already in the early modern times were very were thriving centers of this cosmopolitanism and this cultural exchanges that we see there. And for that reason in and around Machilipatnam we also find that there is the remains of the Dutch fort that was established there. And for the Dutch fort, the prime function of this fort was actually to like store textiles which were produced in and around this region, and then also like sort of exporting them. So this kind of things we find. And then of course there is also this 17th and 18th century Dutch cemetery we find. Those also attest to the fact that how this areas where there's those thriving cosmopolis, and during the 17th 18th century, and also like in the 19th century and so on, and how that particular kind of cultural atmosphere had helped the kalamkari production to grow further. Now in a different situation, we see that, I mean, in the temple town of Srikalahasti, which is there, which is very close to the Pulicat lake, and if you see this, so Pulicat is situated here, and Machilipatnam would be like, I mean, somewhere here in this coastline of Coromandel, so which is very close to Pulicat lake. And in this temple town of Srikalahasti, where we have this great temple dedicated to Hindu god Shiva, Srikalahastishwara temple, and his consort Jnana Prasunambika. And so in this temple, what we see that, I mean, this temple became one of the prime sites for patronizing particular kind of kalamkaris. And this kind of kalamkaris is not just exclusive in Srikalahasti, but also like in the southern Coromandel, we find that there, that how temple cloths are produced or like patronized, and those also sort of demanded, those also required a particular kind of kalamkari making. So this kalamkaris we find that to have extensive figurative drawing, and they are mostly narrative paintings in which we see the narratives are sort of depicted in registers after registers, and then there are also written text with those narrative panels. So this kind of textiles we find them, and either like, I mean, they were displayed in the temples during particular occasions, but also we find them to have been used in this overnight performances and other performances of this Hindu epics in the temple premise. Now there are also other kind of temple cloth we find. So for example, during these chariot festivals that in southern India and in part of like, I mean, and mostly in Tamil Nadu we find, and that would be in the southern Coromandel, we find that, I mean, many of the deities of this presiding deities in the temples, they would be like, I mean, taken out for procession in and around the neighborhood in a very particular time of the year. So the time of the year is like that varies from one deity to another, and during this time we find these elaborate chariots are made, and with these chariots would be also covered with particular kind of textiles, the brightly colored textiles, and some of the textiles would also be they would also have figural representation, and sometimes like, I mean, certain kind of symbols which are associated with these deities. So those kind of temple cloths we also find them to be made in and around these temple towns. So if Srikalahasti is one of the example of such kind of centers where this kind of particular temple hanging made in the kalamkari techniques are produced, then the other places would be in the Tanjavur region or by the river Kaveri, where we find that Tanjavur, Kumbakonam, Darasuram, and then so on. These regions we find that there are some of the centers where these temple cloths are produced in this kalamkari technique. So we can see that, I mean, in one hand the trade textiles, how the trade networks and all those aspects, they made a huge impact on making particular kind of textiles, the textiles that we have already seen, and then in the temple textiles what we see that has a very different kind of flavor, because they would have more of the depiction of the Hindu epics and particular deities and so on. Now with that, let us come to the technique of making kalamkari, that why do we call all this like different kind of textiles under the same umbrella term kalamkari. Now this particular idea of kalam that we see, which comes from this idea of something that has a sharp edge or a sharp tip and that is used for writing is something that came from this idea of a reed pen. And we see that, I mean, how this Greek term that was like, I mean, eventually it was absorbed in the Latin lexicon, and then like it arrived in the Middle East, and from Middle East we see that, I mean, how this sort of like, I mean, became this Persian term kalam, and then this term also arrived in South Asia. And whereas we see today that, I mean, when we say kalam today, we usually mean a particular kind of a pen. But the thing is that, I mean, and even when we say kalamkari, we usually associate kalamkari with this kind of bamboo pen that we see in the left side of the screen. Here we see this bamboo pen, which is fairly simple, like, I mean, a portable pen that we have, and it also has this sharp tip. But then it also has this very characteristic bulbous grip here, and this bulbous grip is something that is essential for kalamkari drawing in these artisanal workshops. So this bulbous grip is something that we see that is made with, like, I mean, layers of cotton, and on the top of that then we see that cotton yarn is sort of used and cotton thread is used for sort of tying it around, and that is how this bulbous grip is created. Now why this bulbous grip is important is because when kalamkari is made, then during that time there is containers full of dye stuff, or like, I mean, this black dye that is sort of like, I mean, used for making the outlines and so on, and even is the same thing for the mordant dyeing as well. So the container full of dye or mordant would be there, and on that in it, like, I mean, this pens are dipped, and then when the pen is dipped, this bulbous grip would absorb maximum amount of this dye into that, and then when the drawer would draw with it, they would slightly press this bulbous grip, and then, like, I mean, the dye would penetrate into the tip of it, and that is how, like, I mean, it is drawn. So this is the reason why, like, this particular kind of bulbous grip is required in kalamkari making. Now if it is about, like, I mean, doing the hand drawn kalamkari, then what about the other kind of practices and why they are called kalamkari there? So here in this image in the right side, here is a representation of a wax drawing kalam, and in this wax drawing kalam we also see that there is this bamboo grip that is made here, like a bamboo grip we find, and then on the bamboo grip we have, like, I mean, iron tip that is used, like, I mean, two iron wires are used for sort of, like, I mean, making the tip, and then, like, this iron wire that sort of also makes this fine tip there, and sometimes, like, iron is used or sometimes copper is also used. Then it is wrapped with human hair. So instead of, like, I mean, using cotton or fabric or, like, I mean, thread here, we see that human hair is used for, like, I mean, wrapping and making this bulbous grip here. So when it is made, and minded that, I mean, for wax resist drawing one needs to, like, I mean, dip it in molten wax, and so for that reason, like, I mean, using cotton and using thread is definitely not the most suited one, but like hair is something that is much more suited for this particular purpose. And so that's the reason, and in this case we also find that usually for this wax drawing kalam, this bulbous grip is much more thicker and bigger in size compared to the regular drawing kalam. Now for that reason we can also understand that for resist drawing and the resist dyed textiles in this particular region can also be termed as kalamkari, because both these techniques they require two different kinds of kalam, but of course, like, I mean, they are very similar in their structure. Now there comes the other kind of kalam, and that looks very different in terms of the first two kalams that we have discussed, and those are these kalams. So these are basically iron made engraving tools, very small, and those are used in the wood block maker's workshop. And in this case what happens, we find that the iron tools which are used with the non-dominant hand, and then a beater is used on the top of it for making the designs, or, like, I mean, any kind of, like, engraved patterns, those will be created on the wood block surface. So in this case what happens, we do not really see them, that, I mean, why this kind of engraving tools are called kalam, but when we sort of like speak to the artisans, so the block makers would always term them as kalam, and kalam is used for something that is to produce this fine minute lines. And it is not just this block makers would call them kalam, but we also find in the other parts of the Indian subcontinent. So for example, in Farrukhabad, in Uttar Pradesh and so on, all these places the block makers would term this particular engraving tools as kalam. And even in Iran today, we see that this particular kind of this engraving tools, very similar to the ones we have here, they are also called kalam, and they are used for engraving on the top of metal surface. So that is the reason we find that why this particular use, this artisanal use of this term kalam is something that also explains why painted, printed, resist dyed, all these textiles are called kalamkari textiles, because the prime images, the outlines or the images which sort of give life to kalamkari is something that is achieved through this tools, and the tools remain central to understanding why all these textiles are called kalamkari. Now, one of the characteristic features of kalamkari that we see that there is that this flowing rhythmic lines, and the lines, if we think that is achieved in the freehand drawing, or like just drawing with kalam, then like these rhythmic lines are also something we find that to have been there in the printed surfaces as well. So for example, if we consider this particular hanging, in this one we see that even though this areas like entirely this image is printed, but like this kind of areas where we see that there is this overall creeper and flower motif that sort of encompasses the entire area here. So this is something that is achieved by like block printing. Now the blocks are made in such a way that the continuity of the lines and these motifs are continued, so they are not disrupted, the continuity is not disrupted in that way, and that is how like the flow of the linear rhythm, something that is achieved in the painted surfaces, are also continued in the printed surfaces as well. Now we also see that how dyeing is sort of like used in these cases, and for dyeing we have many different kinds of dye stuff. So for example, we have the red dye, we have indigo, and for red we have like the indigenous madder, or we have this very well known dye stuff that is extensively used in southern India, that is chaya roots. This kind of dye stuff we also find that to be there, but then this dye stuff is not something that is used directly on the textile, but it is actually used when these textiles are developed after being modern painted. Now with this like we will sort of like continue this discussion on modern painting in the next lecture, and then continue the discussion on the other topics. So what we see in this particular set of like works, or like this top, whatever the topics we have discussed so far, that how the region, particular kind of tools and particular kind of dyes, they all contribute to the making and sustainment of kalamkari textiles. Thank you.